I've done the unthinkable. I own a 3DS. So what's the deal with this? Well, I finally have bit the bullet on spending money on some dumb garbage. Wow, finally. This 3DS is special. I found this on eBay, and what this one is an Ambassador 3DS, something that I've never owned. I desperately wanted to back in the day. So what is this? So the 3DS launched in March of 2011 here in North America, and it did okay at first, and then nothing happened. Yeah, this thing basically struggled for a couple months. That should have been kind of foreseen, considering there really wasn't much content coming out for the thing. Like, the damn eShop didn't even launch with this. It came out in like June, and the only major game that released after launch was Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, which is a great game, but, you know, it's an old game. And at launch, things were definitely not any better. You had Pilot Wings Resort, which, you know, it's a good game, but it's Pilot Wings. Steel Diver, again, you know, it's a fine game, but it's Steel Diver. And Nintendogs plus Cats. I'm pretty sure Nintendo thought that was their saving grace. You know, Nintendogs was this massive hit on the DS, and they were thinking that, launching the 3DS with Nintendogs was gonna make the 3DS a massive hit, where it's like, you know, I don't really think Nintendogs really transcended generations as much as they thought it would. So, the 3DS did very well on, like, launch day, and then nothing for a couple months. It launched at $250 when most Nintendo executives kind of knew, like, they probably should have priced it at, like, $200 or something. And thus, a couple months into it, like in July of 2011, Satoru Iwata announced that the 3DS would be receiving a pretty substantial price cut to $170. That's nothing to sneeze at. Like, it took years for the Wii to drop its price, and they dropped it like $50. This was an $80 price cut just a few months in, which even looking back, like, that's surprising. That shows how dire the situation was, because I think Nintendo was expecting this to be like their next big hit, and, you know, it just wasn't doing very well at launch. So they cut it down significantly. And, you know, I feel like they probably could have waited a little longer, you know, until, like, the big games were coming out. You know, you had Mario 3D Land releasing later that year. You had Mario Kart 7, but it's obvious they made the right call. $250 for a handheld felt a lot more like this is a premium thing rather than, this is an impulse buy. You know, the Wii was $250 when that launched, but, you know, that's a home console. That felt, you know, especially in comparison to the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, you know, that was a massive, massive difference. Or a handheld, especially during the era of smartphones where those were kind of overtaking things, $250 was really ballsy. So Nintendo cut the price a couple months in, and, you know, justifiably, I think they knew people were gonna be upset. You decided to take a risk on this stupid ass handheld that only had, like, what, Cartoon Network Punch Time Explosion? That's worth $80 to you? To make it up to the people that bought a 3DS before the price cut, Nintendo labeled them as ambassadors and gave them 10 free NES games, 10 free Game Boy Advance games, and an ambassador certificate. And when Nintendo announced the price cut was happening, I tried to scrounge up money so fast to just try to get a 3DS before the price cut went into effect. Like, I sold my DSi and I was trying to do all this stuff to get $250 before that price cut date, which was like August of 2011. And then I saw some news reports of certain stores having the price cut early, but those were still ambassador models. You know, like, Nintendo specifically set a date where they were like, if you purchase your 3DS before this date, you're an ambassador. And, you know, some stores put the price cut into effect early, and you could get a 3DS for $170, but it would be an ambassador model, and you would get all those free games that Nintendo offered ambassadors only. The problem was, I sold my DSi to GameStop, and I only had GameStop credit. And GameStop was not doing the price cut early. I think it was like Walmart that did the price cut early, so I was kind of stuck spending less money on my 3DS. Ooh. So I bought my 3DS the exact day the price cut went into effect. I did not get the ambassador games. And yeah, I always had to sit back and ask, what if? Until now! Because I finally got an ambassador 3DS, damn it, and I couldn't be more excited. This is very interesting to me because the NES games, so Nintendo offered 10 free NES games. Those anybody could get, but the Game Boy Advance games, never released to anybody outside of the ambassadors. And I just always thought it would be really damn cool to see what these Game Boy Advance games were like playing on a 3DS screen. And now I can finally do it. So, this is somebody else's 3DS. You know, I just pretty much opened this. And, yeah, they put some time into this thing. They have folders of, you know, virtual console games, and they even have a couple of games that, you know, are pretty beefy titles. I got a digital copy of Smash Brothers 3DS for getting this. This person definitely put some time into their 3DS. Speaking of which, I can definitely look at the play log. Michael here played about 21 games. We can look at let's see, how do we get the full lineup? Let's see, 63 hours in Fire Emblem, 58 in Pokemon, 36 in Smash, playing some Kid Icarus Uprising. Yeah, about 20 hours in New Leaf. Hey, they played the Game Boy Advance game, so, you know, he played Minish Cap for about 18 hours, so that at least shows that, this person got some time out of their ambassador games. Dr. Mario Express for 2.5 hours? Why not more? First thing we gotta check out is obviously the ambassador certificate. Oh my god. Holy shit. Yeah, so this is just a video with scrolling text that's telling you if you want updates for any ambassador program related activities. Here's what you do. And it changes languages every now and then. Let's look at the NES games then. Let's see, Super Mario Brothers, Zelda, Metroid, Yoshi, Ice Climber, Balloon Fight, Zelda 2, Wrecking Crew, Donkey Kong Jr., and NES Open Tournament Golf. This is interesting. These titles have a different, like, demo screen. Like, that's how most NES games look when you download them off of the 3DS eShop. They have the little TV screen, and then they have the little 3D model of the NES here. But then games like Yoshi, very weird. These titles were all released significantly early to the ambassadors. NES games did come to the general public, and all of these games did. There were no NES games that were only ambassador titles. However, when these games were released to ambassadors, they were in an earlier state, and they didn't have features like save states. But yeah, these were the 10 games that were offered to ambassadors. Mario 1, Zelda, Yoshi, Metroid, Balloon Fight, Ice Climber, Wrecking Crew, Zelda 2, NES Open Tournament Golf, and Donkey Kong Jr. Honestly, a pretty weak list. Obviously, Mario, Zelda, Zelda 2, and Metroid are kind of the big ones there. Most of these games are pretty good, but there's obviously NES games out there that are, you know, much better. I would have loved to see Punch-Out!, even maybe Kid Icarus, Mario 2, Mario 3, even Mario The Lost Levels would be kind of cool. There are definitely games that they could have picked that are a bit more enjoyable. Instead, it kind of felt like they went for mainstays that, you know, like, you might not buy. Donkey Kong Jr. on NES, how likely was it that you were going to get that if you weren't an ambassador? Same with Yoshi, Wrecking Crew, Ice Climber specifically, like Jesus Christ, Ice Climber. But obviously the part that was a lot more enticing were the Game Boy Advance games. These were never available to the public. These were only available to ambassadors. And these released a couple months later. I believe the NES Ambassador games came out in December of 2011. The GBA Ambassador games came out in December of 2011. Because these obviously took a bit more time. GBA games are a lot more complicated. And this is really damn cool to see. Like, come on, I've never been able to hold a 3DS that could play F-Zero Maximum Velocity before. This is awesome! And just seeing, like, the startup screen, let me see this. That's cool. I've never been able to see that. Like, one of my favorite things about the 3DS Virtual Console games is just seeing, like, oh man, what's the startup screen like what you just saw? What's that gonna be like? Because, you know, NES games had that. Well, not that. This. There we go. which it was also cool to me for me to see this. Because I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know that originally Ambassador games launched with kind of, placeholder startup screens. However, these were the Game Boy Advance games. The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, and we have Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Advance 3, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, WarioWare Inc., F-Zero Maximum Velocity, Metroid Fusion, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Wario Land 4, and Mario vs. Donkey Kong. What a lineup. This is like some of hey, pick 10 of the best GBA games. A vast majority of these would be on that list. And even then, the worst of the bunch is still hey, I love that it's here. And a lot of these are some of my favorite childhood GBA games. Specifically, we got to do Mario Kart Super Circuit. It may not be a great game these days, but back then, holy shit. It's kind of weird because it's this feeling of obviously, seeing a Game Boy Advance game play on a 3DS, who cares? It's obvious that would work. But just the fact that Nintendo just kept this from the general public for so long, and so many people have been able to play GBA games on the 3DS, the millions that bought a 3DS at launch. I haven't. And it's weirdly kind of hard to find people playing these games on 3DS, it was hard for me to find footage of these Game Boy Advance games in action on 3DS. So here we go. What the f***? Yeah, this is really surreal to actually be playing a Game Boy Advance game, let alone Mario Kart Super Circuit, on the 3DS. I also can't really see the screen right now, so it's a little hard to control this. But yeah, it plays really well. It plays like you'd expect it to. There is a catch though. Come on. Yeah, the GBA games act a little strange. Just as an example, so Mario Kart's playing, hit home. It's still going. Let me also see. So the time says 56 seconds. I'm going to close the 3DS for a couple seconds to illustrate a point here. So 56 seconds. And it now says a minute and 5 seconds. Oh, no. So that little warning on the bottom screen just kind of also says it all right there. About Game Boy Advance software in sleep mode. Closing the Nintendo 3DS while playing this Game Boy Advance software will not put the system into sleep mode. To end the game, press home to return to the home menu. Yeah, so the Game Boy Advance games are a bit strange. You can tell that these weren't fully optimized for the 3DS, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So, I'm just gonna make some assumptions here. I mean, I've looked into this a little bit, but obviously I'm not an expert on this matter, and this is just kind of me just kind of thinking through, just trying to make it make sense in my head, okay, why don't GBA games go into sleep mode when you close your system? Why can't you do save states? Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? Why are they so weird? And why weren't they ever released to the public? So the way I kind of view it is, obviously, the 3DS is capable of playing GBA games. GBA games are, we're 10 years old. The 3DS can play DS games. You can pop a DS game into it right now and play it there. 3DS games are so much more, demanding than GBA games. And, the 3DS can play NES games and Game Boy games and all this stuff, There's no reason why it theoretically shouldn't be able to play Game Boy Advance games. However, that's not what Nintendo really wanted. Nintendo wanted to emulate Game Boy Advance games and wanted those features in these games. They wanted the ability to make save states. They wanted the ability to go home and go into sleep mode and suspend software and all of these extra features that an emulator would allow. And I feel like Game Boy Advance games are demanding enough where they couldn't really emulate them per se. You know how DS games are playable on a 3DS? But DS games are kind of just, it's kind of like Nintendo just put a DS into the 3DS. You know, it's almost like the 3DS goes into DS mode when DS games are playing. When you pop a DS game into the 3DS, it doesn't even it doesn't suspend the software like it would with a 3DS game or a 3DS virtual console game like with an NES game or whatever. You know, like it just goes like, hey, you're gonna close this software pretty much. And the way the GBA games work is very similar to how DS games work on the 3DS. The way this article explains it is this isn't emulation, it's simulation. So pretty much, the 3DS is simulating the act of playing a Game Boy Advance game on the handheld, almost as if like you plug the Game Boy Advance game into the 3DS. Because the 3DS has the hardware to play DS games, and the DS had the hardware to play GBA games. So the function to play Game Boy Advance games is in the 3DS because it has a function to play DS games. You know, the hardware is there to play Game Boy Advance games, but only like play them in the sense of like plugging in a cartridge, because you could do that on the DS. You could plug a Game Boy Advance cartridge into the DS and it would play Game Boy Advance software that way. So you could play Game Boy Advance games on a 3DS if it had a cartridge slot for it, but it doesn't. So what Nintendo did is pretty much, you know, release like the ROMs to play on the 3DS. But, you know, like, it's kind of the same as, like, playing a DS game on here. You can't do save states and you can't suspend the software because that's a feature of emulation. And these aren't emulated. If anything, these are pretty true versions of the original games. You know, like, this is the Game Boy Advance game, all right? It's a way to play the games on the 3DS, but it's obviously not ideal. Nintendo would have preferred emulating the games because then you can make them a little better in some ways. Like adding the save states and allowing you to suspend the software, and also you can kind of make the games look a little better and kind of adjust them for the resolution of the 3DS screen. But as they are, they play fine, you know, like they work on the 3DS, but it's obvious that these are kind of like weird workarounds to be able to play these games, which that's why these games were never available to the public. I think Nintendo looked at these as kind of cool little bonuses, you know, like, hey, you can play these, you know, legendary great Game Boy Advance games on your 3DS, but in a state where it's like, hey, they're totally playable and they're fine, but you know, like, these aren't virtual console titles. These aren't versions of games Nintendo felt comfortable with releasing to the public, I'm sure. So pretty much the long and short of it is these games are pretty much played as if you plug the cartridge into the 3DS, and because of that, you don't really get the extra features and the benefits of an emulated version of the game. Nintendo's pretty much leveraging the chip used in the 3DS to play DS games, and since Game Boy Advance games were playable on the DS, that's how you can pretty much play Game Boy Advance games here. But because of that, you don't get the extra bonus features that you would get with normal Virtual Console releases. So these are kind of weird on 3DS, but they're most certainly playable. It's still really bizarre to be able to play these games on 3DS. It feels like this lifelong dream that I've finally been able to achieve. Oh, God. Nowadays, these don't serve much of a purpose. I mean, there's just much better ways to be able to play Game Boy Advance games now. Even on the Wii U, you know, just like the Wii U Virtual Console versions of these games are just much better. You know, you have save states. The games look gorgeous. You know, like, you even have the manuals. The 3DS Ambassador Program versions of the Game Boy Advance games are a way to play Game Boy Advance games, and not much else. But I have to hand it to Nintendo. These are some high-quality Game Boy Advance games. And they didn't have to do Game Boy Advance games. They could have done something like Game Boy games or Game Boy Color games or anything else that would have been easier and cheaper for them to do. But they went above and beyond and gave ambassadors 10 games that nobody else could get. And sure, they might have been kind of gimped versions of the games in the sense of like, yeah, like, you know, these aren't full-blown Virtual Console games with all the bells and whistles you'd expect. But it's not like they were worse versions because of it. You know, they just weren't Virtual Console games. These are, by and large, the games you expected. And the games they picked, like, my God, really great stuff here. Some of the best Game Boy Advance games, you know, not like the top 10 greatest ones, but at the very least, I'm sure like all these games are in like the top 30, top 40 games. And roughly considering that if these games were virtual console titles, they would be about $8 a pop, you know, $80 worth of content right here. Coupled with the $50 the NES games cost, you know, you're sitting at pretty much $130 worth of value for paying $80 more than customers that would get the 3DS with the price cut. That's pretty good. And that's not even taking into account the Ambassador Certificate. Yeah! It's really cool to own an Ambassador 3DS now. Obviously, this isn't the definitive way to play Game Boy Advance games, and it's not going to be the definitive way for me to play Game Boy Advance games, but there's something kind of magical about seeing those Game Boy Advance games play on a 3DS. And it's just really cool that Nintendo did it. Sure, the GBA games aren't in, like, the greatest state, but they're in a perfectly playable one, and the NES games are cool to have there too. The Ambassador Certificate, my god! This was something Nintendo didn't have to do, but they did it because they didn't want their customers to feel burned. And this was like one of the coolest things Nintendo did for the customer. And they didn't do it for the Wii U when that received a price cut. Because f*** those customers!